Matt Brown, Extra Points, wrote a column yesterday on the Big 12 new television deal. He and I spoke on the phone for a little bit, and he said he'd come on and join us to give us his perspective so we could have different eyeballs. Bob Thompson, 430, who last week thought, based on Brett Yormark's comments to me last week, that he didn't think, if they hadn't been talking years, that anything was imminent. And then Sunday happened. Matt, thank you for your time. Great to have you as a part of the show, at Matt Brown EP on Twitter. Your thoughts about what does this all mean, in your opinion, for the Big 12?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me on here. I appreciate you having me on. I think, like we had talked about here before, if I am a fan of a Big 12 institution, I look at this news and take an enormous sigh of relief. This is not necessarily completely transformational money, like maybe what the Big Ten of the SEC are getting, but it's certainly enough revenue to ensure that any Big 12 institution is capable of competing at the highest level, whatever that looks like over the next couple of years. We're heading into an era of enormous transformational change here in college athletics. We don't know whether there's going to be some kind of power conference breakaway. We don't know if we're moving towards out-and-out professionalization, but no matter what happens, if you're a fan of Oklahoma State or Kansas State or Texas Tech or Baylor, I think you can feel good that your institution is not going to be resourced enough to participate, which, again, if we look and think, you guys know this better than anybody. We've been lurching from one seeming catastrophe to another for this conference over the last 2 years. To come in there and beat some of those expectations based on what we thought was possible a year ago, I think is really significant. And it's especially significant that you get to do all of this if you're a consumer and not have to worry about signing up for 19 different pay services. Your stuff's going to be on ESPN, ESPN Plus, and Fox. You only have one password to remember. I think all things considered, that's pretty good.
Yeah, the one password thing is starting to get bigger and bigger, Matt, as these things get more and more proliferated. One of the things I noticed you mentioned in your newsletter this week was that, is this bad news for the Pac-12? Not necessarily. There's been this kind of, measuring contest between the fans of the two leagues. But if you are a fan of the Pac-12, this isn't necessarily bad news, is it?
I don't look at it that way. To the best that I've been able to pick up now, right? I've talked to a couple of TV people. I've got, text out to a bunch of other ADs. My best understanding is that, last week, the two most likely major television partners for the Pac-12 were ESPN and Amazon. And today, the two most likely major television partners for the Pac-12 are ESPN and Amazon. I don't think that has fundamentally changed. And, whether the Pac-12 survives or what happens with the final valuation of this deal ultimately depends more on the Big Ten than it does Amazon, than it does the Big 12, than it does anything that any conference office out in the West is going to be able to do. I don't look at this as something that is a threat or a yardstick that has to be surpassed. I don't think it's changed the fundamental nature of the conversation.
Matt, was there anything about this deal that raised your eyebrows most? I know for some it might be the length of the contract and the fact that they can get back to the table, the fact that they're on, like you mentioned, ESPN and Fox. Was there anything in particular that stood out to you?
I think one thing that I wasn't completely expecting, and I think could become more significant than maybe some fans appreciate, is the fact that there's now going to be significant basketball inventory across the Fox family of networks, across the Fox flagship, across FS1. And that's important because unlike ESPN and unlike NBC and unlike CBS, Fox doesn't have a streaming partner to stick unlimited sports inventory onto. That's why when the Fox did their major deal here with the Big Ten, that extra streaming inventory goes to Peacock, it goes to NBC, it goes to other platforms. So I don't think that's a bad thing for a Big 12 fan. Certainly Big 12 basketball is an outstanding product. There's no bad teams in this league. I can see why it would be appealing. The question mark to me is what happens with the Big East, which is also already one of Fox's main college basketball partners. Now you've just signed you've committed even more to Big 10 inventory. You're now bringing in Big 12 basketball inventory. And you don't have three other channels to park stuff like ESPN does. So if I was in the Big East offices, so if I was an AD at St. John's or Marquette or Creighton, I'm not saying I'm having an out-and-out panic attack or anything, but I would be a little bit concerned about how Fox values my property moving past 2024, seeing as they don't have unlimited space and they just signed two other really big leagues. they're going to be airing a lot of Central Time Zone inventory.
What are your reactions now? Jamie Pollard, and I saw in your story, and we've had Jamie on this show because we're pretty thick with the Big 12, but mentioned back that the Big 12 existed because of Texas and Oklahoma, and he's right, because there were the two dogs. And as you mentioned, now the Big 12's moving on without them and seem to be pretty stable. What do you think the strength now is for someone like you mentioned, Kansas State or Iowa State, and what this means to them?
Sure. There's a couple of, I think, business takeaways that you can take from this, right? One thing that maybe if we had a time machine and we sat down with Jamie in 2016, certainly we sat in my office, I don't know if you could fully appreciate how strong the demand for live sports broadcasting content was going to be, even as cord cutting has moved forward. There's simply nothing else right now that is TiVo proof. And even as the audience shrinks, the live sports ability to draw an audience has become even more important. And so, I wrote some stories. I think a lot of other smart reporters, over the last decade, wrote some stories about how there might be a bubble for media rights. We're not at that point yet, which shows that things that, hey, in 2016, you thought maybe this wasn't going to be as valuable with a good sales package and some good partners. It is. You can look at this now, and what I think is going to be an interesting part of how this league decides to brand itself moving forward, right, is, outside of, without a Texas, without an Oklahoma, the selling point is about parity, right? This idea that every single football game, every single basketball game, every single bit of competition matters. And that's something that I think this league has tried to use as part of its branding before. I don't know how well it stuck. It's stuck. You've got a different ad team now, some different consultants. I would imagine that's going to be part of the pitch, and part of the pitch to make this a relevant league, not just in Big 12 country, but in places like Los Angeles and in New York City, where there's not a team, there's not a gigantic alumni base to sell that level of competition.
Matt, you mentioned about having one password. I want to go back to that a little bit.
Yeah.
And live sports. Live sports is what's maybe protecting the cable model as it used to be, right? Because if I'm not a sports fan and I just want to watch Game of Thrones or I want to watch something else, I can go to my app that's on, and then I can go to the next one that the next show I watch is on, and I don't care. It doesn't matter. I watch it on my time. But if I'm going to watch flip through 3 football games at once, I really gonna hate it if I have to go to the ESPN app, Peacock, and to Fox or Paramount to get all these different games across the apps, or when I could just go on my television and hit last 4 and watch all of them just with one click of a button.
I think you're exactly right. And that's especially true, I think, for college football. And there's, as a generation rises here, that when they're at home, they're often watching with multiple screens, right? You're having a football game on, you might have Twitter open in another tab, you might have something else. And if you're streaming, not only is it a pain in the butt to shift between different apps, but you're often 2 or 3 plays behind what you might be relative to cable. And I think lots of people will watch a game streaming and realize, like, oh, okay, the game got tipped off Twitter, or the game got tipped from somebody else, tweeting, play-by-play. The experience of watching Game of Thrones, or some other, television drama, whether you're hooked up to cable or watching it on Netflix or something, I don't think it's significantly different. That might not have been the case in 2015, but it's the case now. But that gap hasn't really been closed with live sports yet, especially, and this is another thing to think about, I think, within the Big 12 footprint. We still have a lot of states where not everybody has access to really affordable, high-speed internet, and where your experience for streaming might become much worse, where cable then becomes a safer option with reaching still a larger potential audience.
Matt, this is a different topic, but I know you've been discussing it, and I think everybody in college football has been discussing it today. Auburn making the move with Brian Harsin now out, new AD hired. You've I'm sure seen all the talk about how good this job is or isn't or whatever, but what was your initial thoughts, or what are your initial thoughts on Auburn's vacancy now?
Yeah, Auburn is such a fascinating place to me, I think, right? Like, it's one of those jobs. I think Louisville is one of these markets too, where it seems like everything is constantly happening all of the time. I think if you were an Auburn beat writer, you haven't had a normal week in like 2.5 years.
Right.
And some of that is the subject of the coaches you brought in. Some of that is because of the very lively and active booster culture you have there, and the high expectations and everything else that comes with it. I look at this job, and on one hand, it's very appealing for a coach because you can win a national championship at Auburn. You can recruit at a blue chip ratio at Auburn. You have access to a lot of elite talent, not just in Alabama, but in Georgia and throughout the Southeast. And you're going to have access to the kind of financial resources that you need to be successful. If you're the Auburn head football coach, you have generational wealth, right? The challenge, of course, is you might have that generational wealth because you've been canned after 2.5 years. The expectations are very high, and it's a place where there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And when I look at many of these high-level programs over the last decade or so, places like Texas, places like until this year USC, places like until this year Tennessee or Miami, places that have every level of baseline advantage that you could possibly expect. It's not an accident why they haven't been successful. And part of that is for things that have nothing to do with what's going on the field. It's not a job where people typically are able to stay for a long time and enjoy a lot of success. So I'm not sure who the best person would be to thrive in that kind of environment. It's a place where I could see it. If you bring in Deion Sanders, you bring in Lane Kiffin, maybe you win a national title in year 3. Maybe you get a congressional investigation in year 3. Like, anything is possible with Auburn, which is great if you're in the content business like we are.
Matt, a publisher of Extra Points or at Extra Points, again, I mentioned at Matt Brown EP on Twitter, has been with us before and also here again with us on 365 Sports. Thanks for your time, my friend. We appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure, gentlemen. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, sir. You too, at Matt Brown EP. Wrote an article